Don't Go Down There by Closet Brony 87. The air of death in the bleak midwinter was stifling. Leaves lay rotting and crushed under the tide of bitter snow. Ponyville lay in the shadow of the Canterhorn, the streets all but abandoned by the normally friendly ponies that made their home there. Only the occasional pedestrian, wrapped up as best as a mortal may in protection against the wrath of the cold, would normally be struggling through the dead, colorless streets. Tonight, however, tonight was as barren and lifeless as a cold desert wasteland. Hearth's warming eve was past, the cheer of its time only a fading memory through the brown and decrepit remains of holiday trees that lay discarded next to their previous homes. The night fast approached, and the tessellation of gray stratus clouds hung over the town like carrion birds awaiting the final death rattle of their victim. It was in this dreariness that a lone yellow Pegasus battled through the snow towards her destination. Fluttershy let loose a meager utterance of fear as she felt the cold gnawing at her bones. Winter was, of course, her least favorite time of the year. It was in winter that her animal friends slept. It was in winter that her friends rarely visited, for her house sat in the glare of the ever-free forest, a forest whose malevolence was ever more evident in the chill of this time of the year. She often found herself visiting them instead, which was hardly a more comforting course of action than staying home. The long walk into Ponyville left her vulnerable to both the deathly cold and the unknown animosity she felt around her. It seemed that Fluttershy had the curse to feel every bit of acrimonious aura of the season, far more than any other pony could. She had once asked Twilight about it, but as might be expected, without quantifiable evidence, she was apt to dismiss her concerns.
"You're just depressed because of the weather, Fluttershy. There are a lot of ponies that get depressed when it's raining or cold. If it was something magic, I would feel it. Trust me."
She always said some form of the same thing, but it was a comforting and cathartic statement, nonetheless. Usually. Fluttershy had tried to rationalize the situation, as Twilight usually did, but was utterly ineffective on her own this time. The aggressive atmosphere would overwhelm her brain to her despair. She had to see Twilight again. She had to receive soothing reassurances from the indefiable logic of the studious mare, if only to calm her nerves for a short time. Maybe she should ask Twilight if she could live with her during the winters. There was little work to be done in her cottage during the season, little to distract her from that pre-meeting feeling of dread. Only the comfort of friendship could see her through the dead season this time. She halted briefly, her baby blue galoshes buried up in the rim in snow. She was in Ponyville proper now, with all its wintry variation, muted colors, piles of snow around dead trees, its complete lack of any pony in the streets, and the echoing, cloying silence. With every step towards her destination, she felt her spirit dampen more and more towards the same bleakness of the world around her. The shadows themselves seemed to stalk her, as every time she turned her head, they seemed to shift maliciously, only allowing their movement to be caught by the very fringes of her peripheral vision. The death and emptiness leered at her, and she felt every ounce of hatred in the quiet surreptitations of the wind. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong indeed. She had to get inside, lest she be taken in by the madness around her. She looked around desperately, her fragile pink mane blowing ever so slightly in the chilling breeze. Sugar Cube Corner wasn't but a block from here. Pinkie Pie lived in a room above the store. That was part of the many perks of her apprenticeship. The cakes usually didn't mind visitors. Hopefully they would excuse the unorthodox hour of the visit to take pity on that half-frozen Pegasus. Pushing through the waves of snow with all the energy she had left, she finally reached the side door that led to the abode above. She held her forehoof up, and with minute hesitation, rapped smartly on the door. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a familiar smiling face.
"Hey there, Fluttershy!"
cried Pinkie happily, the mirth in her eyes warming the fragile sanctity of her mind.
"Hey, Pinkie,"
she stuttered in return, jaw vibrating from cold.
"Well, come on up before you freeze to death, silly.
smiled Pinkie as she hopped up the steps to the residence proper. Fluttershy quickly followed. A weight lifted from her mind as she got out of the malevolent winter air. This house was warm, not only physically, but spiritually, too. She was safe here. She knew it. She ascended the stairs behind her friends before entering the sturdy wooden door into the home of the Bakers. The home was a relatively new one. She could see radiators in the main living room and the hallway towards the bedrooms instead of fireplaces of older houses. The usual candle brackets were replaced with clean, flickering oil lanterns. The furniture was modest, but homely. The cakes, neither the couple nor the twins were in sight, a fact that made Fluttershy raise her eyebrow. "The cakes went out until tomorrow," Pinkie said, as if reading her mind. "I'm here babysitting until they get back." Fluttershy knew better than to question the power of Pinkie's eccentrics. Smarter ponies than her had tried, and been driven to the brink of madness by it. She merely smiled and took a seat next to her friend on the couch, which was thankfully facing the warmth of a radiator. Her snow-clad boots and coat lay forgotten at the front door. "So, what brings you here tonight?" asked Pinkie, looking over with glee. Fluttershy looked into the cheery sky-blue eyes of her friend. There was nothing but happiness in those eyes, nothing but love and friendship.
"Oh, I was just going to see Twilight. I wanted to know if she could help me with something."
"Ooh, maybe I can help you instead. What did you need? A party? A coffee?"
She gasped at the onset of a glorious epiphany.
"A cupcake party?"
"None of that, no,"
smiled Fluttershy serenely at the antics of her pink friend.
"I just wanted to have someone to talk to."
"I can do that,"
smiled Pinkie happily.
"as long as we don't wake up the twins. I put them in bed an hour ago, and that's about all I can handle in one day. So, what do you want to talk about? Cake? The number 6? You want to try and impersonate each other's voices? I bet I'd be really good at that. Ooh, I know! Let's tell scary stories!"
I don't know if that..."
started Fluttershy quietly. The last thing she needed right now was to be put more on edge.
"There were once 2 friends just like us, on a night just like tonight. Little did any pony know that these 2 friends were actually lovers. They were all alone that night, so they decided they would have super fun by making out. So they start making out when the phone rings. One of the ponies answered the phone, and the voice says on the other line, 'What are you doing with my daughter?' She hung up the phone and told her friend what happened. She said, 'My dad is dead.'"
Pinkie took a deep breath and revealed what she thought was the scariest part of the story.
"Then who was phone?"
Pinkie stood up on the couch and stretched her limbs as far as they would go in an attempt to tower over Fluttershy. The oil lanterns flickered, and she panted from the exertion it took to tell her story. Fluttershy looked up at her and giggled daintily behind her hooves. Pinkie simply smiled back and settled back down on the couch next to the Pegasus.
"Now you tell one."
"Oh, I don't know if I can do that. I'm not very good at scary stories."
"Sure you are. I bet you have a great imagination. Just say the first thing that comes to your head."
She smiled gingerly. Even if she could come up with a good scary story, she wouldn't. The last thing she needed was to be scared of the creations of her own mind.
Okay. Once there was a pony named Sprinklebutt."
She stopped to giggle at the absurdity of the name she had come up with on the fly.
"I like it already,"
Pinkie said happily.
"And Sprinklebutt was really, really nice, and he lived in a bright sunny land, and there were rainbows every day, and lots of happy friends, and..."
She looked over sheepishly at Pinkie, who appeared to have fallen asleep, complete with snores. As soon as she stopped talking, Pinkie awoke and smiled wryly at her friend.
"Sorry, I didn't mean to fall asleep. Your story was just so... boring."
Pinkie broke into a huge grin, oblivious to the inconsiderateness of her response. Fluttershy sighed deeply and acquiesced.
"There were 2 ponies alone in the woods," she started uncertainly. She looked towards Pinkie, who smiled encouragingly. "They were alone in the woods, and they were cold, and, lost. They wandered the woods, but they never talked. They knew that if they talked, they would be lost forever.
The radiator in front of them sputtered, unnoticed by either occupant. The purifying heat that had previously emanated throughout the room began to die off. This would normally be something that Fluttershy would be apt to notice, for Fluttershy fears the cold above all else. However, so engrossed was she in her storytelling that the slow lapse of warmth in the room was something she was not wont to notice. Her very essence seemed to chill, and fogs of frost spilled out of her breath far sooner than Pinkie's did. The coldness extended to her voice, and while the speaker was undoubtedly always Fluttershy in timber, the mannerisms morphed into something that was definitely not a shy yellow pony. It was as if the cold itself began to tell the story, the cold that Fluttershy so feared.
The creatures of the woods watched them. The ponies saw yellow eyes watching, but they didn't say anything, because they were afraid. They were afraid the eyes would take them any moment. One of the ponies, Sweet Holly, had forgotten to wear a coat, so her friend, Gilded Fire, gave her his coat. Even though she had a coat, she still couldn't get warm. As she shivered, she thought she heard a voice coming from beyond. All it said was, "Don't go down there." She thought Gilded Fire had said it, so she asked him, but he shook his head. The ponies kept walking. Eventually they came to a hole in the ground. It had a stone staircase in it that led downwards. The two ponies stared at it and felt a fiery warmth blow up at them. Finally, Gilded Fire said,
"I'm going down there, Holly. It's cold."
"I don't think you should. The voice told me not to go down there."
"Are you sure you heard a voice? Maybe the cold is making you hear things."
All that Sweet Holly could do was shake in fear and cold that no coat could break and no fire could warm, except the fire in the pit in front of them. Gilded Fire left her and slowly walked down the stone stairs, his iron shoes impacting loudly as he went down. Sweet Holly was left alone in the cold, and the eyes kept staring at her. After half an hour, Gilded Fire still hadn't come back, and the warmth from the pit had faded. The eyes and the darkness started closing in on her, and she got scared. She called down the pit, "Fire! Gilded Fire! Are you down there?" The only response was a demonic voice, deep and seething with hate, thundering into her soul.
"Gilded Fire is dead. His torment will be eternal. You are lost." Fluttershy panted heavily, clutching her limbs around her to shield herself from the sudden onslaught of cold, the cold that had been building yet remained unnoticed to her until now. Pinkie stared at her, eyes wide, mouth curled into a horrific grin of amazement.
"Wow, Fluttershy! Where did you hear that one? I don't think Rainbow Dash could even come up with a story like that." "I don't know," she responded, her voice returning to its usual level of timidity. "It just came to me. You told me to say the first thing that I thought of." "Well, it was super!" Pinkie smiled. "I'm going to have to remember that one. I can't wait until Dashy and I go camping again." "It's cold," Fluttershy whimpered, pulling into herself more. The lifeless, frosty air seemed to surround and penetrate her. She began shaking violently. Pinkie grabbed her to pull her into a warm embrace, but the mare's touch was icy. It wasn't anything like the bubbly, warm bundle of energy Fluttershy was used to. It was as if the cold itself was turning her friends against her, turning them into constructs of sin like itself. Fluttershy jerked away from her. "It's okay, silly," Pinkie said with a warm smile. "I'm probably cold too. Let me go down to the cellar and put some wood into the furnace."
As if in answer, a shrill cry erupted from the room below down the As if in answer, a shrill cry erupted from a room down the hall. The Cake Twins were up. The look on Pinkie's face fell for a split second before being replaced once again with her signature smile.
"Could you go down to the cellar and fill the furnace? Pretty, please, with sugar and whipped cream and cherry and nuts on top."
Fluttershy nodded. Of course. For a brief moment, the lips of Pinkie's face sneered into a twisted grin. It was a grin devoid of any warmth or tranquility that was usually worn on its owner's face. The grin said something. It said something sinister. It said that Pinkie knew something that Fluttershy did not. A strange wind whipped through the house, a wind from an undetermined source of an undetermined cause. It made Fluttershy shake in fear as the grin became wider.
Oh, if it's okay, I was going to go to Twilight's. Is it okay if I go? I mean, after I put the wood in the furnace.
Pinkie's grin quickly changed into a polite, puzzled expression, then a frown.
Well, okay, but you have to stop back after you're done. It's really cold outside, and I want to make sure that you're still okay, okay?
Fluttershy hesitated.
Okay.
You, Pinkie, promise? She sighed. She really didn't want to come back. Not here, not in the cold. But even more frightening was the thought of breaking a Pinkie promise. It was almost like doing so would invulnerably bind their souls, so that anywhere she might go, Pinkie would be liable to be there.
Cross my heart, hope to fly, stick a cupcake in my eye, she whispered feebly. Okie dokie dokie then, Pinkie smiled. I'll see you when you get back.
Fluttershy attempted and failed at smiling back. She walked with ungraceful footing towards the door, where she donned her soaking wet coat and boots. The door at the top of the stairs shuddered with an ominous boom as Fluttershy closed it behind her.
Just refuel the furnace and get to Twilight's. That's all you have to do.
As soon as she exited the door at the bottom of the stairs to the outside, she immediately regretted leaving. The whipping wind once again started biting at her face, her eyes teary and dripping from the assault. A harsh yet subdued murmur filled her ears as she pushed through the cold towards the trap door leading down towards the basement. She could feel an angry presence all around her, as if the very eyes of the cosmos were judging her. The water in her coat and boots began freezing once more, turning to ice around her skin. As if to mock her, a flurry was called down from the heavens. Large particles of snow swirled around her, completing the dreary atmosphere of the bleak midwinter. She gritted her teeth and trudged on. A trap door built into the ground at the side of the house came into view. It was covered with a mild dusting of snow, which she shakily brushed off with her boot. A cold iron handle protruded from the center of the doors, which she deftly grabbed with her teeth and pulled back. Trepidatiously, she tiptoed to the edge of the opening and peered down. It was dark, very dark. No visible candle or lantern existed in this wet stone pathway. She could barely make out what seemed to be a large wooden door at the bottom. She wondered if she would even have the strength to open it in her current state. She stepped over onto the first stair, a faint sound of hoof on stone echoing through the hallway. Don't go down there. Fluttershy froze, her heart rapidly beating out of her chest. There was some pony behind her. The voice was definitely feminine, and something familiar. She would say it took a lot of courage to stay where she was, but that was a lie. Fear paralyzed her. Fear flew through her veins like a phoenix of ice. Then why was she turning around? She had no control over her body. She wanted it to run. Instead, it made her turn to face her accoster. A mare stood in the shadow of the alley, away from the light of the full moon. It was holding something close to her chest, but she couldn't see what it was. She didn't want to see it. Whatever it was filled her heart with foreboding. Who are you? The figure stepped forwards into the light. Fluttershy recognized her immediately. It wasn't someone she interacted with much, but she knew her. Gray coat, blonde mane, bubble cutie mark. In front of her stood Derpy Hooves. Only, she didn't sound like Derpy. The Derpy she knew had a clumsy, almost endearing manner of speaking. The mare in front of her had a voice more comparable to an icicle. Cold, sharp, deadly. Her eyes were another thing. The Derpy she was familiar with had adorable, albeit slightly unnerving wall eyes. This pony's eyes seemed almost anarchic. They would look at something, like a normal pony would, then would spin and twist and move in directions she was sure weren't possible. However, it was the bundle in the crook of Derpy's foreleg that disturbed her the most. She didn't know why. She knew what was probably there. It was Dipsy, Derpy's baby foal. If her memory served her, Dipsy was born around the same time as the Kate twins. Loud, almost listened sounds assaulted her ears as the foal suckled on her mother's teat. Derpy paid no attention to this, and her eyes spun around to look deeply into Fluttershy's own, boring into them as if she were trying to unearth her very soul. "Don't go down there."
Why?
"Don't go down there. Don't trust any pony."
Um,
"Don't trust any pony, least of all yourself." Fluttershy tried hiding behind her long pink mane. It was an instinctive reaction, one she often put into effect whenever she was nervous. She just wanted to hide, but she had to know what the other Pegasus meant.
Derpy?
But there was no answer. She looked up and found she was quite alone in the alleyway. There were hoofprints where Derpy had stood just moments previously, but in all honesty, she couldn't tell if they belonged to the wall-eyed Pegasus or her. "Derpy!" she cried out desperately, but the call was muffled by the dampening effect of the snow. The only echoes she could hear came from the stone passage at her hooves, where it echoed malevolently, morphing into a vitriolic cry of hate and desperation. She couldn't take it any more. She had to get to Twilight's. Her fear and apprehension fueled her as she galloped through the oppressive snow as fast as she could. She even attempted to spread her wings to take flight, but found them quite immobile from cold. The ice in her feathers wouldn't allow for much flight, even if she could. As she got within a few blocks of the Golden Oaks library, she found that she was unable to continue at the same pace, and reluctantly slowed down to a walk. The cold was pressing into her, as if struggling closer to ice over her very heart. Glancing into the distance, the faint light of the moon was just able to illuminate the silhouette of the dead branches of a great oak tree. A much-needed warmth spread through her. She was almost there. Twilight would make her feel better. Twilight would show her how illogical her fears were. She had to. She needed her to. The minuscule glimmer of hope that she had conjured was quickly frozen over with one horrifying realization. She wasn't alone out here. There were eyes everywhere, eyes coming from all directions, glowing in the light of the moon. The figures were whispering about her.
Is she the one? Where is she going? What do we do?
Fluttershy emitted a mild squeak and hid her eyes in the snow. If these figures were to attack her, then she didn't want to see the end coming. She would rather lay down in the sheer deprivation of the snow, not feeling, not seeing, not hearing. She waited for several minutes, but nothing came. The menacing whispers of the figures around her continued, but she could no longer understand the words over the howling wind that bit at her ears. She chanced looking up. Her eyes had adjusted to the dark, and she could now make out the shapes of the specters. They were ponies, hundreds of ponies, and they all stood out in the cold without hat or jacket from the sole purpose of staring at her. She didn't want to talk to them. She could just feel something in her gut telling her that would be a bad idea. She decided the best course of action was to ignore them. With some effort, she raised herself up out of the snow and timidly walked on to Twilight's house. Okay, that was part 1 of Don't Go Down There by Closet Brony 87. I hope my speech impediment didn't really make too much of appearance. The actual story isn't in 2 parts, but I have a headache. I ate a cookie, which was a really bad mistake. I get headaches from eating cookies. They're too sugary. Anyway, I need a little break before I continue reading. So anyway, thank you for watching. Part 2 will be out soon, hopefully-ish. I should really just continue right like 5 minutes later. Anyway, thank you for watching / listening. Goodbye.